everyone present over here. As in the loving memory of late Dr. Avdesh Kumar Singh sir, we have inaugurated Dr. A.K. Singh Literary Club in the Department of English in Bakht Kavi Narsimehta University in Junagadh in the presence of his wife, Dr. Kiran Singh Madam, who is also the advisor of Sri Aurobindo Integral Life Center in Oro University, Surat, and Honorable Vice Chancellor Professor Dr. A.H. Bapodra sir and Dr. Ravi Zala sir and Dr. Firoz Sheikh sir on 19th March 2025. Now I, Disha Tolia, student of MS Semester 2, welcome you all in today's Expert Talk series. Today we have esteemed speaker Mr. Parth Joshi sir with us, and he is currently working as an assistant professor and head of Department of English in Government Arts and Commerce College of Rajkot in Babra in Amreli, and he was formerly on the faculty of English in Department of Christ College in Rajkot, and he qualified his UGC NET, GSET, and even GPSC in English at the first attempt, and worked on modern urban Gujarati poetry and for his MPhil dissertation. And he is currently pursuing the PhD in the area of comparative Indian aesthetics and poetics. And he won 3 gold medals for having topped in the English department and the arts faculty during his masters at Saurashtra University, and topped in Rajkot city for his Sangeet Visharad in Indian classical music. And Mr. Joshi sir has translated 2 IIT Madras funded courses for the NPTEL, and he was among the winners of the Times of India public speaking contest in Rajkot for 2 consecutive years. And noteworthy among his all publications are an edited an anthology on high modernism with a foreword by Padma Shri Sitanshu Yasas Chandra, a paper on Akupar that was ranked in the top 5 literature papers of the world on the SSRN, and a paper on the Indian connection to the Westland that was published by South Florida Journal, and 4 books and over 10 published papers. Sir, I request you to please begin your today's session.
Thank you so much, Disha. I believe I'm audible.
Yes, sir, you are.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone from the Department of English, BKNMU, and those who are watching live on the YouTube. My greetings and my pranam at the very outset to this great teacher, Professor Avdesh Kumar Singh, who, as in the very first session, inaugural session, Kiran Madam, Sheikh Sir, Zala Sir, all had pointed out that he was a builder of institutions and also a builder of the careers of so many students, thousands of students. Uh, and I also can take pride in calling myself a part of this fraternity because I was probably the last research scholar, the last breed of among the last breed of research scholars at Saurashtra University who could have the benefit of Singh sir for shaping my research proposal, and my dissertation that I'll be submitting shortly to Saurashtra University owes a lot to him and his ideas. And he knew very well, how in one meeting, as we were talking the other day, how to change the lives of students in just one meeting. And probably I can call myself to be bearing a living testimony to this fact. Having said that, BKNMU is in some way another home because my wife hails from BKNMU. She is an alumnus of this department, and so it is always very, very cordial and welcoming to be at the Department of English, BKNMU. So at the very outset, I place on record my gratitude to Sheikh Sir, the team of faculty members at Department of English of the university, and the team who is carrying out this entire endeavor so very actively and enthusiastically. With this, I enter my topic. Please let me know, Disha, whether my screen is visible to you or not.
Yes, sir. Please, sir.
I believe the slides are visible.
Is it? Yes, it is visible, sir.
All right. My topic for today is modern British poetry. It is noteworthy that I am in the line of speakers incidentally queued right after Professor Mukherjee. So here also one sees a kind of tradition. Sanjay Mukherjee, for example, is the student of Professor A.K. Singh, as he said, and I uh, happen to have learned modern British poetry from Professor Sanjay Mukherjee. So whatever I'm presenting today owes to these two great teachers, Professor Singh and Professor Mukherjee. Professor Mukherjee, who taught us, modern British poetry, and Professor Singh, I owe gratitude to him for the fact that the second half of my presentation, which will be a comparative reading or an Indian reading of modern British poetry, this rigor is something that he has installed in all of us. So, remembering these two great teachers, let me enter my slides. So, we begin with understanding the word modern, and on your slides, you will find two pictures. On the left hand side, you have the quotation from Malvikagnimithram, which is the debut play of Kalidas, one of the iconic Indian writers, which I have tried to juxtapose with Mrs. Dalloway. Let us remember that we are celebrating the centenary year of Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway. Both these writers are spatio-temporally different. They are separated by a time span of almost 1500 to 2000 years and belonging to different nations and cultures. But if you see, uh, Malvikagnimithram was the first play of Kalidas, and this is the second shlok, actually the first one because it comes right after the Nandi shloka. So it happens to be the first one. But anyway, the opening verse of this first play by Kalidas, very famous, which says, Puranam iti eva na sadhu sarvam, na cha api kavyam navam iti avadyam. Everything that is old is not always good, and everything that is new is not always bad. Puranam, Purana, Junu. Everything that is Purana is not always despicable, so to say. Sorry, not always good, and everything that is new is not always to be looked down upon. Na cha api kavyam navam iti avadyam. Remember, Kalidas was making this statement when he was making his debut. So one finds an emphasis on the new in this verse. That there is a tendency to bring something new, to bring something modern, that is observed in a play as old as 4th or 5th century Common Era. Virginia Woolf, who came as such just 100 years back. And if you take up this quotation, it says Mrs. Dalloway, what she loved was life, London, this moment of June. So, London indicates the spatial dimension, space. And this moment of June. Not the past, not the old, but this moment. So the tendency, again, of the past having passed and the emphasis on the present, what T.S. Eliot very aptly calls the pastness of the past in his essay Tradition and the Individual Talent. The point that I'm trying to make is that the tendency on bringing something, the emphasis on bringing something new has always been there, even before what we know today as modern British literature existed. And this is what leads us to the difficulty in defining the modern, because in that sense Kalidas was also modern when he was making his debut. Then shall we say that the Renaissance people were not modern? Renaissance was also a kind of modernism. Weren't the Restoration playwrights and the Restoration theatre new at its own time? What would you then say about the Romantics? I mean, the Romantic revivalists like Wordsworth, Coleridge, Keats, Shelley, etc. They were modern in their own times. And so was Tennyson and Browning, and so was Eliot, and so was somebody like Philip Larkin in his own time. So modernism, this term modern, it brings with itself the inherent difficulty of definition. Modernus, the Latin root, is which means now, and its Indian equivalent adhunik. Adhunik comes from adhuna. Adhuna in Sanskrit is now. This now is a very, very slippery concept, because the moment you say now, the now has slipped, the now has already passed, so the now becomes then, right? So it is very, very difficult to say what is modern. And of course today, when we are surrounded by technology, a phone that you purchased today becomes outdated tomorrow. So it is very, very, it is all the more difficult to claim anything as modern today. So it's not an absolute category, it is a relative category. Every age would think of itself as modern. So then what is modern? Andrew Saunders, the very famous Oxford History of English Literature, he abstains from defining the modern or giving the characteristics of modern, because he has probably realized this difficulty, that the moment you define the modern, 10 years later you will have to revise your own definitions. So what he does is, interestingly, he takes up 8 poets of the 20th century, and he elucidates upon the characteristics of their poetry, and he says that collectively these are the characteristics or the traits of modern poetry. So modernism challenges any kind of absolute definitions. Now students often confuse between Modern, modernity, and modernism. These are sometimes terms we use exchangeably, but there is a danger there. The first quotation that you see on your slide is from Meenakshi Mukherjee's Mapping the Elusive Terrain literature, where she says modernity emerged in Europe as part of an evolving historical process, triggered off by certain social, political, and technological changes, and consolidated by a paradigm shift in the realm of knowledge and philosophy. Modernism is a literary or aesthetic mode, while modernity pertains to the mindset and lifestyle of an individual or a society. My teacher used to say that modernity is the condition of being modern. It's a socio-cultural condition. It it includes a certain kind of new mindset, progressive mindset. Although progressive is a pregnant term, but a certain kind of progressive mindset, forward looking, in simple words, and lifestyle of an individual or a society. Now, if somebody has embraced this modernity, how does that person express that modernity? How does a writer express that modern outlook? He will express it by, now coming to the quote by Susan Friedman, the next quotation, the expressive dimension of modernity is modernism. Encompasses a range of styles among creative forms based on an engagement with historical conditions of modernity in a particular location. So the writer is located in a particular country, region. He has to interact with his history, the historical conditions, the socio-political conditions of his predecessors and of his contemporaries, and therefore negotiate certain boundaries. It is there that this literary modernism becomes manifest. So if you go to the last line by the in the previous quote, Meenakshi Mukherjee very aptly asks, can literary modernism manifest itself in our writing without its social and material corollary, modernity? Modernism is not possible without modernity. And what is modernity? It is the social and material corollary of modernism. Now, if you see, modernity, the socio-cultural condition of modernity is, as I earlier said, time specific and region specific. For example, if you go to the previous quotation by Virginia Woolf, there is a, what she loved, London. So there is a space that is referred to. She the writer could have said Mrs. Dalloway, for example, preferred any other rural place, but she is making it specific that Mrs. Dalloway loved London. So urban space. You see, this is a socio-cultural category, urban space. And we know that modernism is a lot about urbanization, the emphasis on the urban life. So Mrs. Dalloway, she loved London and this moment of June. So there is space mentioned there in the quotation, and there is time mentioned in the quotation. So modernity has to do with time and space. Now, as the time and the space keep changing, we will have to note that modernity also would change. So there is nothing like a singular modernity. We, as students of British literature, read Eliot, Virginia Woolf, James Joyce, Yeats, Pound, Auden, etc. And often we think that that is the modernity that is portrayed in these works is the only kind of modernity. No, these are British writers. What about, for example, Latin American writers? Their socio-cultural conditions were different, and so their modernity was different. What about American writers? Their modernity would naturally be different. What about modernity in Russia? It would naturally be different. Remember, 1917, you had the mm, uh, you had the Russian Revolution. And then what about modernity in the third world countries, specifically South Asian countries? Our modernities are certainly going to be different. So in the last 30-40 years, there's a huge body of literature and research that is proliferating on alternative modernities and alternative modernisms. Therefore, because the modernities are different, we will have to think of alternative socio-cultural conditions. So we will have to think of different modernisms. So there is nothing like modernism, there are modernisms. That is something we need to remember as students. So for example, modernism in India will be definitely different from the modernism in Europe. Modernism in Latin America will be definitely different from the kind of modernism that, for example, Russia had. So we will have to think of modernism in plural. All right. Now, this is about socio-political and cultural condition. As students of literature, we are concerned with the aesthetics of modernity, how modernity is represented in works of art, whether it is painting, music, literature, etc. So the aesthetic modernity is characterized by attitudes of a changed consciousness of time. Changed consciousness of time. Artists who call themselves aesthetically modern, you will find in them a changed consciousness of time. And this changing consciousness is expressed through the avant-garde. Avant-garde, you know that it is actually a military term that stands for invading new territories. Now, these artists, they are exploring new territories in terms of art. And when you explore new territories, there are definitely the dangers of sudden shocking encounters. You read the works of Eliot, Joyce, you take up, for example, a work like Ulysses, or take up a work like Finnegan's Wake. We come across sudden shocking encounters. Take Mrs. Dalloway, for example, or To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. So we have something very, very shocking as we read through these works. What are these writers doing through such sudden and shocking encounters? They are conquering the normalizing function of tradition. Tradition has this tendency to normalize everything, keep things at par. If I want to be an avant-garde, if I want to be a modern, if I want to do something new, I will have to conquer this normalizing function of tradition. Remember T.S. Eliot's Tradition and Individual Talent, where he says tradition is a good thing, but being traditional, Eliot rejects the tendency of being traditional, right? And rebelling against all that is normative. So the established norms and modes of writing the modernist writers would rebel against these norms. This is from Habermas's very famous Modernity and Incomplete project. Professor Singh had his own views on modernity and modernism. The book that you see on the slide, uh, and whereby I also want to recall, my last memory with Professor Singh in 2019, the year which he passed away. I was doing my MPhil on uh, modern urban poetry, specifically Niranjan Bhagat, the Gujarati writer, and I was falling short of technically certain, very crucial resources. That is when we visited Oro for a seminar, and I shared it with sir that, sir, this is where I'm stuck. This particular book was under publication then, 2019, and it has this article, Modernity as Renewal Mechanism, Alternatives to Modernity in India, by Singh sir. He had just got that article for proofreading. So, and this article is very crucial in the understanding, and it was very crucial for my thesis as well. He immediately, now see the generosity of this teacher. We were sitting in the provost's chamber, and he calls up his PA and says, that article, Routledge article that has come up for proofreading, take a printout of that. And he said, so he called for the article and immediately handed over the article to me. This article that is yet unpublished, and I still have as a very fond memory that article with Singh sir's, side notes, footnotes, this, that, his handwriting, which he was proofreading. In an interesting article, insightful article, notable because he gives two contrasting senses of modernity. We say that modern means new, novel. But he says the European sense of modernity is different from the Indian sense of modernity. Because, as I said earlier, somebody who is trying to be new, he has to interact with the tradition. And in interacting with the tradition, the writer will either become novel without the tradition or within the tradition. The European sense of modernity, to Professor Singh, is novel without the tradition, becoming new, escaping the tradition. And therefore, you have, the discourses of ruptures or breaks in the 20th century Europe. These are all instances of novelty without the tradition. Why so? Because the European sense of time, he told me, is linear. So in a when the outlook towards time is linear, if you have to go outside that, if you have to do something new, you have to definitely jump the tradition, and therefore ruptures and breaks. The Indian worldview of time, on the other hand, is cyclical. Cyclical. So in the Indian tradition, Navya, new, is Nutana. So you have Puratana and Nutana. But this Nutana is still within the Sanatana, the perennial. So when we talk about doing something new, an Indian mind, an Indian artist assimilates from the tradition and then goes ahead, something that Eliot had already talked about in the 1920s. That an artist will have to assimilate from the existing ideas. In the 1960s and 70s, we had the discourses of ruptures and breaks. That is when theory with T capital changed things. But otherwise, Eliot, and remember, Eliot was very well grounded in the Indian philosophy, had talked about Nutan within the Sanatana. So the perennial remains, and within that, the artist does something new. Modernity as a renewal mechanism. Why? Because to him, modernity is the renewal of ideas. Ideas are eternal, ideas are perennial. It is like a flowing river which will have its own antarbhava, pradurbhava, lopa. So it will hide. So if the Ganga emerges from the Gangotri, it will have its tributaries and distributaries. It will branch. Then again, at certain areas, you will find that the river is it hides itself, and then again it re-emerges. So this is renewal. So the Charvakas, for example, were new. They were modern in their own times. Buddha was modern in his own time. Sankhya philosophers were modern in their own times. Nanak, Kabir, Narsingh was modern in his own times. Students of this department, when you read of the poetry of Narsingh Mehta, shall we say that sitting in the 15th century, 15th, 16th century, 17th century, Narsingh Mehta is not modern? He is. So was Meera, Dayanand, Vivekanand, Gandhi. All of them were modern in their own times. Why? Because it is through these thinkers that ideas renew themselves. They place themselves in a certain perennial tradition while becoming new. This is, as I could understand, the view of Professor Singh on modernity, which I think we should take note of in this lecture series when we try to understand modernism. All right. Now, modern British poetry. Our common understanding of modern British poetry is that it starts in the 20th century, or modernism in English literature starts in the 20th century. Is it so? Routledge history tells Queen Victoria died in 1901, but most of the certainties of the Victorian age had disappeared long before. We know that Victorian age was a very, very, kind of a golden age for England. But long before Queen Victoria died, uh, from the second half of the 19th century, things had started changing in England. We will see how. The 20th century begins before the end of the 19th century, another statement in the Routledge history of English literature. Because most of the factors that were crucial to the shaping of the 20th century British literature, most of these events actually took place in the later half of the 19th century. For example, Marx's Communist Manifesto comes out in 1848, which declares that there is a fault in the worldview that, for example, religion has given us. Marx said that history is actually a record of class struggles. So he gives a different worldview, a new worldview. This is 1848. Remember, 1850, William Wordsworth, the last of the Romantic poets, dies. 1859, Darwin's Origin of Species comes out. He also rejects the conventionally held worldview. He gives the theory of survival of the fittest. And we know that religion was in crisis. And poets like Tennyson had to come forward to foreground religion again through poems like In Memoriam. The Education Act of 1870 uh, is noteworthy for two reasons. Number one, through this act, education for children from 5 to 12 or 13 years becomes compulsory in England. So, the children who went to school in the 1870s and 80s, remember, they are, when they grow up in their 30s, late 20s and 30s and 40s, they are going to be the participating soldiers of the World War I. And all these soldiers are going to be literate soldiers, unlike their predecessors. They are able to read and write, and therefore they are able to uh, narrate the encounters of the war, the experience of the war. These soldiers would write letters to their family, to their friends, etc., which will become, then works of literature, memoirs of war. We will have in the early 20th century an entire subgenre of poetry called war literature, poetry as well as prose. War literature, that is, an outcome of the writings of these soldiers. Now, the fact that they could write is thanks to the Education Act 1870. Secondly, this act makes education compulsory, so there are more number of people who are able to read and write in England. So reading and writing both proliferate tremendously. There are more readers available, and of course there is technology to print, and therefore more and more number of books start coming out. So the market of books grows, and therefore we have the mass production of literature from the 1890s onwards. Mass production of literature, and also what is known as popular literature, because a lot of literature has to be produced, mass production has to be there, so everything that comes out is not going to be good, classic. So a lot of popular literature. So it is in the early 20th century that the rise of popular literature also takes place. And because there is a rise of popular literature, the binary of the classical versus massical literature, the classical literature versus the popular literature, the elite literature versus the popular fiction, this binary, this divide starts getting stronger. This is the second indirect outcome of the Education Act of 1870. 1885, Nietzsche pronounces God is dead. 1887 is the Golden Jubilee celebration of Queen Victoria. Her accession to the throne took place in 1837. So in 1887, it is her Golden Jubilee celebration. But remember, by 1887, the queen herself had started becoming weaker. Her powers had started fading. Her husband had died, so she had also started secluding herself. there was there were voices of rebel that had already started coming up from the colonies. Remember 1857, uh, the first you know uh, cry of freedom had already come from India, and kindred rebels from other colonized countries. So by 1887, Golden Jubilee celebration of Queen Victoria, and remember it was also attended by, let us say, kings of Saurashtra. For example, the king of Gondal was invited in Queen Victoria's Jubilee celebration. The king of Wakaner had been invited in the Golden Jubilee celebration, and many others for that matter. So while the Golden Jubilee celebration was organized in a grand way, the English royalty had certainly realized that the glory of the British Empire is fading away. 1899, the Boer War from Africa. So we have the rebel from South Africa as a colony, which inspired. You might know that the Boer War was an inspiring force in Gandhiji's starting of Satyagraha. So there were voices of freedom struggle coming up. Einstein's theory of relativity marks the progress in science and technology. Introduction to psychoanalysis by Freud in 1917, so the growth of psychology. Invention of radio, TV, cinema, photography, X-ray. One might remember, for example, J. Alfred Prufrock and the mention of X-ray in the poem. And of course, along with all these things, we need not forget the Great War. World War I, 1914 to 1918. H.G. Wells has famously called this war as the war to end all wars. We know that there are figures that are devastating. Almost 10,000 soldiers dying every day in the war, and certain grim realities of life England had to face during this period. So modernism is something that pervades all these realities, and therefore it is essentially post-Darwinian, a search to explain man's place in the modern world. Remember, the position of man, the anthropocentrism of man had started changing in the modern world. Religion, social stability, ethics, everything was called into question. This resulted in a fashion for experimentation, the tradition of the new. So it was very, very significant to change the modes of writing literature as the realities around the writers were changing. Eliot has, again, very famously, when he writes a review of James Joyce's Ulysses, he says the prevalent modes of poetry could not match with the immense panorama of futility and anarchy, which is contemporary history. That is the history of his own time. And what were the prevalent modes of writing poetry? I have one example for what was the kind of poetry written before these writers cried for a tradition of the new, making it new. And that is the very famous anthology of poetry, Francis Palgrave's Golden Treasury, which was used even in India as a classic anthology of teaching poetry in schools and even in colleges. The Golden Treasury is one of the oldest and certainly the most classic anthology for the study of English poetry that was used in schools for teaching poetry to children in those days. Remember, there was no poetry being taught in colleges and universities until you have I.A. Richards and the League of New Critics. So until the 19th century, poetry was taught only in schools. So it was meant only for children. Yeah, that was the belief. And of course, you cannot teach a lot of serious poetry to school children. This Golden Treasury, the first published in 1861 by Macmillan, as you can see in the picture. Most of the poems of this anthology were selected, with annotations, notes by Francis Palgrave. And he had also consulted Tennyson, who was the poet laureate at that time. And these selections by Palgrave used to make up the canon of poetry until that time. That is what is being taught in the name of poetry. All other things are just creative writing. It is not a part of classroom discussion. Only those poems which are included in these anthologies become a part of the canon. So the canon consisted of the poems which were selected by Palgrave. And what kind of poems did he select? Palgrave's criteria was fixed. He said only the poems of the poets who are dead. Living poets do not deserve a place. So in 1861, when the Golden Treasury was published, the last of the poets to be included were the early Victorian poets. Early Victorian poets. The first poem is by Thomas Nash, one of the university wits, 16th, 17th century. From there to early Victorian poets. That was the canon. And maximum poems in the anthology were Wordsworth's poems. And we know that Wordsworth's poems are lyrics. They are sweet songs of nature. If you see below the Golden Treasury, the subtitle of the book is also The Best Songs and Lyrical Poems in the English Language. Now, when such an anthology makes up the canon, it is very certain that the canon contains all very jolly, happy, nature-based, pastoral, romantic kind of poetry. And it gives an impression, general impression, that the poetry is nothing but, sing-song style. One representative poem from the anthology I have picked up is Thomas Nash's poem, and I have highlighted two words over there, spring and cold. Spring, the sweet spring, is the year's pleasant king. Then blooms each thing, then maids dance in a ring. Cold doth not sting, the pretty birds do sing. These were the kind of poems that made up the canon of poetry. Remember, cold is, cold symbolizes death, darkness, trouble, difficulties. And the line says, cold does not sting. So as if everything was very, very happy, jolly. The 20th century writers had a problem against this. So when Eliot, in the previous slide, we saw that Eliot was saying that the kind of poetry that is written and taught does not match the futility and the anarchy that exists. He was mentioning to these kind of poems, and that is why Eliot had a problem, and the modern poets, all of them, most of them, had a problem against romantic poetry. So one very, very important characteristic of modernist poetry is the rejection of Palgrave's The Golden Treasury and the kind of poems that were prescribed there. We might also, for example, recall, Eliot's Wasteland, where the first section is called Burial of the Dead. Now, if Palgrave, his criterion for selection of the poems was that only those poets who are dead can make the canon. And remember, this is a criterion even today in many universities. When the syllabi are framed, certain very old and conventional school teachers, they say that this particular poet is a living poet, and therefore he cannot be included in the syllabus. That means only those poets who are dead can form a part of the canon. So if that was Palgrave's criterion, Eliot's heading, the burial of the dead, would metaphorically mean the burial of the canon. Let us bury the existing canon of poetry. Let us come up with a fresh canon. So to me, probably this is also one indication that the burial of the dead gives. It is a plea for the construction of a new canon. All right, characteristics of modern poetry. Most of them might be familiar to you. Um, Modern poetry is largely the poetry of urban themes. It is not romantic, it is highly realistic, sometimes surrealistic, filled with new anxieties and difficulties because of the war. It is stark, tragic, grotesque. And this brings us to Hardy. We are going to probably discuss, at least one poem by Hardy, that is the Darkling Thrush, the very famous poem by Hardy, which will uh, you know demonstrate practically these characteristics and the socio-cultural political situations of the times. So I thought at least that poem I should read in 5 minutes. So after this slide, when we go to the trajectory of modern poetry, we will certainly read Hardy. The first point on urban themes reminds us of city poetry and the very important presence of city in modern poetry. The imagery that we find in modern poems is, for the most, and even in modern novels and drama for that matter, is city imagery. Remember Virginia Woolf, Mrs. Dalloway prefers London, the city. T.S. Eliot's Wasteland has unreal city, for example, a phrase that he borrows from Baudelaire, Flowers of Evil. Unreal city. Or you know Ezra Pound's In a Station of the Metro. So the metropolitan life, city life, is what is foregrounded, and the alienation of the city life is one major theme in modern poetry. So the apparition of these faces in a crowd, apparition, he could have used the word people, and he could have used the word appearance in place of apparition. Faces is also two syllable. People is also 2 syllable. So meter wise, it wouldn't have made a difference. But he uses the word faces. And we who are either living in a city or keep on visiting cities, we know, for example, the other station of Mumbai, that we only can see hardly see faces, and we do not know who is the person. We do not know the names, and we certainly do not know where they come from. So this is the difference. So apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough, is what Pound says. So fragmentation, stream of consciousness, images. We know that imagism, T. Hume, images poetry. You know? So instead of long description, just present an image. This is one way of experimentation. Impressionist paintings. In painting, we have Marcel Duchamp. Images, actually, what imagism does is, imagism is one method of capturing the impression of something. So it is an extension of impressionism in that sense. When you present an image, you are actually presenting an impression. For example, descending staircase, 1912. So only an impression of the descending staircase can be captured, and that as an image is presented. Eliot very famously says, a heap of broken images. Wasteland is nothing but a heap of broken images. So catching the impression of certain things and presenting. Arthur Symons' symbolist movement in poetry that inspired Yeats and Eliot. We know about it, movement towards a new poetic diction, polyglottism, use of multiple languages. Again, Eliot's Wasteland is an example, excellent example. Polyphony, the presence of multiple voices in the poem. No single coherent voice in the entire poem, but multiple voices. Intertextuality, elusiveness, complexity. No single diction also. Right? Multiple styles coexist. There is fragmentation and the degeneration of society that is represented. I wanted to select these lines from the Wasteland. They appear in probably the fourth section, no, the fifth section. Cracks and reforms and bursts in the violet air, falling towers, Jerusalem, Athens, Alexandria, Vienna, London, unreal. Now, all these are towering civilizations, falling. They were once upon a time grand civilizations of the world, but they are as if falling towers. So much so that the very concept of civilization seems unreal. So, if we have to draw a kind of trajectory, a chronology, modern poetry starts with decadence and the French symbolists, and then we have Thomas Hardy, then there is Georgian poetry. From 1912 to 1922, we have the Georgian poetry for a very brief time, and just 4 or 5 poets, not more. They were followed by the imagists. We have Amy Lowell and T. Hume, we have Ezra Pound, etc., who focused on clear, hard, dry images instead of long descriptions. So that was another way of experimentation. We have the war poets, who were also called the trench poets. Like I told you, the soldiers who were school children under the Education Act, they now become the participating soldiers, and they are able to write poems, they are able to write letters, they have the first hand experience of the war. So we have Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon, um, you might recall other poets as well. There is W.B. Yeats, of course, Eliot, and the Auden group, like Stephen Spender and the others. This is roughly speaking the chronology of modern poetry. I will spend 2 to 3 slides speaking on specifically the wasteland and then go to an alternative reading of the wasteland, because it is such a representative poem of the modern times. Fundamentally, the poem is a war poem, but throughout the poem, there is no direct mention of war, surprisingly. The wasteland that Eliot shows, it is not a physical or a geographical wasteland, but a spiritual, culturally desolate place. Unreal city, as I said, under the brown fog of a winter dawn. A crowd flowed over London Bridge. A crowd flowed over London Bridge. Crowd, people would generally walk, but this is the crowd is flowing. किसका crowd है ये? Crowd में कौन है? The crowd is of dead people, corpses, and the water was taking them along. So they were flowing. The crowd flowed over the famous London Bridge. So many. I had not thought death had undone so many. This death is not just death due to war, but when the person dies from within, morally, socially, spiritually, culturally, a civilization also dies. So he says, I had not thought death had undone so many. Polyphony, fragmentation, etc., I've already spoken about, especially the second section, uh, the section on chess, game of chess, is notable for the polyphony. There is a Derridian lack of center in the poem, and so the poem yields very well to deconstruction. Maybe that we may discuss some other day. Certain important facts about the wasteland. The first mention of the poem by Eliot is in a letter he had written to John Quinn on 5th November 1919. The second mention that he was writing a poem like this, although the poem had not completely been written, but he had started writing something like this, he wrote to his mother in 1919. Remember, 1922 Wasteland gets published. 1919, Eliot had already started writing. We know that those of you who have read the, or at least known certain biographical facts about Eliot, know that his first marriage was a troubled marriage, and for almost more than 15 years he had to live with his first wife, Vivian Eliot, who was schizophrenic. It was a very bad time for Eliot. He was working in a bank, trying to earn a livelihood, enduring this very, very troubled married life, as a result of which he also was suffering from a nervous breakdown during October to November 1921. The second section, Game of the Chess, you have the line, "My nerves are bad tonight." Yes, bad. That is an autobiographical reference. So in 1921, this couple, they go to Kent and Switzerland to get some fresh air. Meanwhile, Eliot was still drafting The Wasteland. And early in January 1922, he finishes the draft, the original draft of Wasteland, which was more than 800 lines. Pound was a friend and a mentor to Eliot. So while returning from Switzerland to England, he stops in between in Paris to hand over this draft of this very big poem to Pound. And Pound, whom he calls his il miglior fabbro, the better craftsman, is the one who edited the poem, performed a Caesarean operation, as it is famously called, to the poem, and brought down the length of the poem from 800 plus lines to 433 lines. The current title, The Wasteland, was also given by Pound. The earlier title, as you can see on the slide, that was given by Eliot is He Do the Police in Different Voices, which he had taken from Charles Dickens's novel. 4 sections of the poem were ruthlessly edited by Pound. The only section that he found that he did not edit, he found that there was no need of correction, was the 5th section, What the Thunder Said. And the notes that are written in Eliot's draft, and that facsimile edition is now available. Near the 5th section, Pound has noted, okay, here on, I think. I think from now onwards, that is the 5th section, things are okay. Need no correction. This manuscript was rediscovered in 1968. Currently, it is with New York Public Library. And Eliot's second wife, Valerie Eliot, who was a personal assistant to Eliot, after Eliot's death, she published this facsimile edition in 1971. And when we started discussing The Wasteland in our MA, we were lucky that we were shown this facsimile edition with the notes of Ezra Pound by my teacher, Professor Sanjay Mukherjee. The sources of Wasteland, again, those who have read a bit, they know 2 important sources are there. One is Jesse Weston's From Ritual to Romance, a work on anthropology and rituals. Another work is a seminal work in magic and religion, as it is called, The Golden Bow by James Fraser. It is important because the myth of Fisher King is taken from these 2 works, especially from Ritual to Romance. Section 5, Fisher King appears and he says, I sat upon the shore fishing with the arid plain behind me. Shall I at least set my lands in order? These fragments I have showed against my ruins. And then the section 5. That comes from Jesse Weston's From Ritual to Romance. Two things in the beginning of the poem are notable. Actually, 3 things. One is the epigraph, second one is the dedication, and the third one is the opening of the poem. The epigraph that you see, he takes from Dante. He borrows it from Dante's Inferno. In Dante's Inferno, there is the mention of the Sibyl of Cumaean. This Sibyl of Cumaean wanted to be immortal, and therefore she got a boon. She asked for immortality and got the boon of immortality, but she forgot to ask for youth, that I should remain young along with immortality. So what happened? She started showing traits of old age, but she could not die. So the character in the epigraph, the Sibyl of Cumaean, Time is passing, years are going. She has grown to be wretched, but she cannot die. This is actually the condition of the Western civilization that Eliot is portraying in the poem. People said after the First World War, they wanted to die, but they could not die. Civilization had turned so corrupt. Eliot thinks it is better if the entire civilization had got exhausted in the war. So cracks, the word cracks is used in the lines that we earlier saw. In the towers, there are cracks now. This epigraph is followed by a dedication, Il miglior fabbro, the better craftsman, the better craftsman. And this is a dedication to Ezra Pound, his mentor. Great support system to Eliot, great scholar, and he calls him the better craftsman. And the third is the opening of the poem, very famous, April is the cruelest month. As we all know, this is, it alludes us to Chaucer, April is the sweetest month. Chaucer, the father of English poetry, is being acknowledged over here. And then, related to this is Eliot's views on tradition and individual talent. In the next 3 to 4 slides, I thought I will speak a bit on the Indian connection to the wasteland. Because again, this is what Professor Singh taught us. Whenever you read, he said, always have that Indian eye whenever we are reading Western literature. This poem has a deep Indian connection. The poem has use of 6 foreign languages, allusions to more than 35 non-English writers, be it European or from any other culture, 35 non-English writers. And you know that the Eliot had to write an extensive note, explanations to the lines, to the allusions. But out of all these, for Ezra Pound, who actually shaped the poem as it is today, the essential meaning of the poem can be reduced to 4 words, and all the 4 words are Sanskrit words. Datta, Dayadvam. I'm sorry, the third word should be Damyata instead of Dayadvam. Datta, Dayadvam, Damyata, and Shanti. These 4, so Shanti is used thrice at the end of the poem, we know. So the entire essence of the meaning of the poem is limited to these 4 words. Surprising for us as Indians. So what is the Indian connection? When we talk about the Indian connection to the wasteland, the connection lies in terms of the texts, the teachers, and the traditions that influenced Eliot as a poet when he was writing Wasteland. Eliot's first exposure to Indic thought, Indic philosophy, as a child, he reads 1879. He reads Sir Edwin Arnold's, again very famous book, Sir Edwin Arnold's The Light of Asia, which is a a book about Buddha's life. And this, for the first time, got him interested in Indian philosophy. 1911, Eliot enrolls into the Harvard Philosophy Department for his undergraduate. And there, his first teacher, Irving Babbitt, very famous philosopher himself, and the most influential teacher for Eliot during his entire Harvard career was Irving Babbitt, who first taught him philosophy, and he taught him always Western vis-a-vis Indian philosophy. I mean, Asian philosophy in large. So he would teach Aristotle and Confucius. He would teach Buddha and Christ together. So Irving Babbitt's presence was very, very significant for Eliot. The second teacher is Professor Charles Lanman. Charles Lanman is the editor of the Harvard Oriental series. All the Sanskrit texts, important Sanskrit ancient texts, were translated for the first time in English by the Harvard Oriental series back in the early 20th century. Professor Charles Lanman, himself a very, very great scholar of Oriental studies, he was the editor of this Harvard Oriental series, and he was the teacher of T.S. Eliot. Lanman taught him Indic philology, elementary Sanskrit, and Pali. The third teacher is Professor James Woods. Professor James Woods is one of the earliest translators of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras in English. In the third year of his college, Eliot enrolled for an advanced course on Patanjali's Yoga Sutras under James Woods, the first one of the earliest scholars on Yoga Sutras himself. Side by side, he was learning the Buddhist school of philosophy under Professor Masaharu Anesaki, a Japanese visiting faculty of Buddhism at Harvard. And the fifth was his PhD supervisor. Eliot was never able to complete his PhD. He could not reach for his, in what we today call his final viva. He had submitted his dissertation on F.H. Bradley under the supervision of Professor Joshi Royce, but he could not reach for his final viva because of his family situations. So Eliot was never, that way a doctorate, by the way. So Joshi Royce, his PhD supervisor, also had studied Sanskrit under Charles Lanman. So when Eliot was pursuing his PhD on F.H. Bradley, he was also learning Sanskrit and Indian philosophy. During his study at Harvard, these are the texts he read. Sometimes we feel that we as Indians also have not read these texts sufficiently. But see, here is Eliot reading, for example, the Vedas, Upanishads, Yoga Sutras, Panchatantra, Ramayana in Sanskrit, Mahabharat, of course with English translations, but then these Sanskrit texts, and the Jataka tales, the Nikayas in Pali, all these he had read thoroughly. He owned a copy of Dyosan's The System of Vedanta and the Philosophy of Upanishads, one of the classic texts for learning Upanishads, German writer Dyosan. But Eliot, the copy of Upanishads that he used for his classes, Eliot used for his lectures, was a copy called the 28 Upanishads, published in 1906, edited by an Indian teacher of Upanishads, Professor V.L. Shastri Fansikar, a Marathi teacher. It was Nirnay Sagar Press, the famous Nirnay Sagar Press. What you see on the right hand side is a copy of that book, published in 1906. And below that, you have Eliot's teacher, Charles Lanman, is presenting that copy to Harvard College in 1908. So this is the handwriting of Eliot's teacher, Professor Charles Lanman. V.L. Shastri Fansikar sends that copy to Charles Lanman. Charles Lanman is presenting that copy to Harvard College Library, and it remains there. And Eliot borrows that copy, and in that copy, 11 important passages from the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad were marked by Professor Charles Lanman himself. And we know very well that the fifth section, the Datta, Damyata, Dayadvam, these are things picked up from the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. So, where do you have the roots of this Datta, Damyata, Dayadvam? In this copy, 1906 copy of the 28 Upanishads, in which Professor Charles Lanman had marked certain important passages for Eliot, which he used, and he read extensively even the commentaries on those passages. A copy of this book is preserved even today at King's College Library in London, and it has those pencil notes by Lanman and also by Eliot. My hypothesis is that Yoga Sutras has very famously has very crucially influenced the wasteland. I will give two examples. Eliot himself called Yoga Sutras an extremely subtle psychology. By the way, this is Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, a copy of it. This is the Advaita Ashram copy. Small book. Sutra literature in India is never hardly 50 pages. Yoga Sutras he called an extremely subtle psychology, something more than an arbitrary system of classification. According to Jessica Cloud, who submitted her dissertation on T.S. Eliot, The Wasteland and Yoga Philosophy in 2018, she says yogic philosophy informs the structure of the poem. In the wasteland, one can see yogic philosophy in the form of a journey. This journey gives shape to the poem, which I argue begins with the recognition of suffering and pain. In the beginning of the poem, the first section, the burial of the dead, you have the recognition of suffering and pain and the obstacles to overcoming that pain. Taken together, the 5 sections of the poem depict a yogic journey similar to that depicted in the Yoga Sutras. The Yoga Sutras, what it does is, it gives you the causes of the suffering and then how to overcome those suffering in 8 stages, and then finally how to reach the state of samadhi or liberation from the sufferings. So according to Jessica Cloud, the poem also does the same. And in the paper that Disha mentioned in my introduction, the paper that was published by this University of South Florida, I have in detail described this entire, I've developed this entire argument. But in brief, section 1 and 2 explore the causes of the suffering. Section 3, the fire sermon, explores the concept of disgust and also the process of detachment, because it is about Buddha's fire sermon. So detachment is quintessential to Buddhist philosophy. The 4th section, death by water, it moves towards the attainment of that state. The 5th section is about the final attainment of equanimity. The 4th section, the shortest, where the Phoebus, the sailor, drowns, death by water happens. It is about the attainment of that state. And then the 5th section, which was written when Eliot was mentally stable under the treatment of Dr. Witthaus in Switzerland. That is when the 5th section was written. The 5th section talks about equanimity. Eliot was also in a state of equanimity at that time. And so that section reflects on equanimity and peace in everyday life, and the cultural and the revival of the cultural spiritual wasteland that is depicted in the 4 sections. And that is why Joyce has not edited that section. He has said, not Joyce, sorry, Pound has not edited that section, he has said here on it is okay, okay. The fifth section does not require any change. So the two examples that I'm going to give is one from the opening of the poem, one from the closing of the poem. The opening of the poem talks about mixing memory and desire. April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead, mixing memory and desire. Memory is related to past experiences. Desire is related to future. Eliot is talking about mixing memory and desire both. Remember, both memory and desire are actually uh, dangerous for anyone who wants peace, because memory will retain the past experiences. Patanjali in the Yoga Sutra says memory is one of the vrittis, Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha, the famous sutra from the Yoga Sutra. So there are 5 types of chitta vrittis that Patanjali enumerates, and memory is the first among them. If you want to attain the state of yoga, you will have to control memory, control the reminiscences of the past experiences. And desire will always reinforce this memory, especially the memory of the bad things that happened. So what happens is the cycle of pain and pleasure continues, according to Patanjali. So it is from these dull roots, the fourth line, remember, dull roots. It is from these dull roots the tree of karma grows. And so you have the latent deposit of karma and the bondage. And it is this bondage that makes April the cruelest month. Not only for Eliot, but for so many characters in the poem, like Marie Lariche, Stetson, Phlebas, Madame Sosostris, so many characters. So all of these figures indicate the ambiguity of unfulfilled and deeply repressed forms of memory and desire. Unless brought to the surface, these can only lead to death by water in the ocean of samsara, or worldly experience, or, to change the metaphor, fear in a handful of dust, as Eliot uses in the poem. This is about the first section and the opening of the poem, and then the closing of the poem, because we don't have much time, just the opening and closing lines, Shanti. In the fifth section, Eliot famously uses the sea was calm. What is the sea? The ripples of memory are now, bad memory and desire are now going away. The ripples of consciousness. In the Yoga Sutra, the term that is used for the English translation of this chitta vritti is the ripples of the consciousness. Shanti occurs thrice as at the end of the poem. Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. And in the translation, Eliot has translated this Shanti as peace which passeth all understanding, if you see the notes given by Eliot himself. This peace which passeth all understanding is a line that he has taken from the Bible, the Philippians 4:7. So this is again bringing together, synthesizing two cultures, Indian and the Western, and this is always the attitude that Eliot has had. However, he himself says that this peace which passeth all understanding is a feeble translation of Shanti, because he knows that in the Sanskrit lexicon, Shanti has a range of meanings like tranquility, equanimity, absence of passion, absence of sexual passion, which also forms an important part of the poem. So, absence of all these things, and therefore you can have a kind of table. One meaning of Shanti could be to become tired, to finish, to stop. So the poet has exhausted himself of describing the horror of the war, and he possibly wants to stop, he wants to finish. He has got tired of of describing about the war, and so at the end of the poem, and remember it is a very abrupt ending, he says Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Now I want to stop. The second meaning possible could be to be satisfied, and again this is there in the Sanskrit dictionary. To be satisfied or content. Shanta comes from sham, shamana. In Jainism we have shamana, right? To be satisfied, to be content. It's contrary to the first meaning. He is satisfied with the description he has made, and now he wants to end on a note of hope, right? So we know that we sometimes say that the Wasteland is not a poem about despair, it is a poem of hope because it ends on a positive note. This is that positive note. Importance, spiritual importance, cultural importance, sexual importance, so this could be the third. Importance is also a meaning of Shanti given in the Sanskrit lexicon. And curing the symptoms of a disease, shamana, rog ka shaman hota hai. So curing the symptoms of the disease. So the poem has given a catharsis to the psychological state of Eliot by the time he finishes writing these 5 sections, and therefore biographical details tells us that he was in a better state of mind when he was under the treatment of Dr. Vitus, and therefore when he came back he had finished the draft, he was mentally much more stable, and he submitted the copy to Pound. But anyway, what we can definitely say is that the poem is a prayer for personal and civilizational peace. Peace at 3 levels. Eliot was a student of Sankhya philosophy, and Sankhya philosophy defines peace at 3 levels. Adi Bhautika level, the physical level, Adi Daivika level, the level beyond the physical level, and Adhyatmika level, that is the spiritual level, the spiritual peace. So Shanti is what I mean to say is Shanti is not just peace that passes all understanding. It is a very, very limited translation. The word Shanti is very broad, and all these shades of meaning can be included under the word Shanti. Remember, Eliot was also a student of Pali, and Khanti or Khanti in Pali is a word that means patience, forbearance, and forgiveness. There are 3 meanings of Khanti in Pali: patience, forbearance, and forgiveness, which then, if you take the Sanskrit translation, Datta, Damyata, Dayadvam. These are the 3 equivalents possible of patience, forbearance, and forgiveness. And that is why not Joyce's statement, but Pound's statement that these 4 words form the quintessence of the poem can be justified, because the very word Shanti leads us to uh, Datta, Damyata, and Dayadvam. So it is a cycle being repeated, right? So this was an humble attempt to give an alternative, just a glimpse of an alternative reading of the poem, The Wasteland, and just to give a taste of uh, how interpreting a very, very high modernist poem, high modernist British poem from an Indian angle could be. Uh, Thank you very much, and thanks to the better craftsman, Professor Avdesh Kumar Singh, that he instilled in us this sense of uh, looking at works of literature from multiple perspectives. With this, I end. Thank you so much. If there are any questions, they are most welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for this very insightful and engaging session. And your knowledge has truly enlightened us. And I'm sure that everyone here has gained very new perspective and ideas to learn something. And yes, special thanks for the session on the YouTube session on the Westland. It was truly useful for all of us as it is a part of our syllabus also. And before
Okay.
we
Oh, I didn't
conclude,
know that. Thank you.
yes, but we loved this Westland session. Before we
Thank you so
conclude, if
much.
anyone has any questions, then feel free to ask. You can drop your question in the chat box of YouTube. Sir, there is a question.
Okay. Harsh is asking, can we say that poetry has done more justice in define? Do you mean defying or defining the modern age compared to non-fiction novels or drama? Um, what I understand is you mean defining, probably. Yes, of course. Modern poetry. I mean, of course. See, modern age, like the postmodern age, was rich in all the three genres, equally rich in poetry, prose, and drama. Yeah, but certainly, uh, if we have to teach modernism in class, we will have to take recourse to poems because that is time wise more manageable. Like, uh, I forgot to. uh, I had the Darkling Thrush open before me, but I forgot to read the poem. I had promised I would read it. But you see, for example, this short poem, the Darkling Thrush, can um, characterize. It can show you the characteristics of modernism in a very very compact manner, rather than going to a novel by say Woolf or Joyce, or a drama by Shaw, for example. Right. So poetry can define any age in more compact and representative manner when it comes to classroom teaching. And therefore, even in discussing modernism, poetry is a more handy tool as compared to a novel or drama. Of course, uh, uh, poems like Wasteland are landmark works of modernist poetry, that we certainly can say. But so is the case with something like, um, you know, Ulysses, which was published in the same year as Wasteland, but it is a work of prose. But discussing Ulysses, you know, demands more time. That is why probably Wasteland, and of course, because poetry appeals to human emotions more, that is also another reason poetry can be more defining of modernism as compared to novel. Yes.
So there is a comment from my classmate Kiran Wadia, and he is saying that feeling truly grateful to learn insights into the Westland from Mr. Parth Joshi sir. It is an enriching experience, and especially as it is a part of MA Semester 2 syllabus.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
If anyone has any further questions, then please ask.
I would, to the students of MA who are going to, read Wasteland as a part of their syllabus, I would suggest that you begin with reading this For the Seal poem, The Darkling Thrush by Thomas Hardy. Thomas Hardy is a Victorian novelist, but a modern poet. And this poem is special because it was written in December 1900, the last day of December 1900, when the century was changing. How, for example, he again Thomas Hardy picks up the tradition of bird poetry in English. So bird poetry is a very important aspect of Romanticism. For example, you have bird poem Ode to a Nightingale by John Keats. or Ode to a Skylark by P.B. Shelley, bird poems. So he takes up thrush, is a bird. He's darkling. This thrush is darkling, is aging, decaying. So there itself, the metaphor changes into a gloomy kind of an atmosphere rather than the jolly atmosphere that prevailed in the Romantics. So the age that they are entering, is also a gloomy age. And there are lines, the century's corpse, for example. So the 19th century is, the poet feels as if the dead body of the century is lying, right? And so many other things. It's a wonderful poem. I suggest students to read and discuss this poem. Yes.
Sir, there is no any further questions from students. Should we end this session?
Of course, at your disposal.
On behalf of members of Dr. A.K. Singh Literary Club and the Department of English, Bhakt Kavi Narsimha Mehta University, Junagadh, I extend my deepest gratitude to Mr. Parth Joshi, sir, for this enlightening and thought-provoking session. And sir, we are immensely grateful for your time and this valuable contribution. And thank you all for being such a wonderful audience. And a special thanks to technical support team, especially Mr. Varun Pandya, a research scholar of this department. Thank you all. Thank you once again, sir.
Thank you very much, and
Yes,
keep up the good work. Let us all read more, let us all discuss, and
yeah.
let us all keep meeting. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.